A shelter worker notices an elderly golden retriever curled up in the corner of his kennel. His coat, once vibrant and golden, now hangs dull and patchy around his thin frame. The soft amber eyes that surely once sparkled with life stare vacantly at the concrete floor. At first, she thinks he's just another surrender, another casualty of people's changing lives and priorities. But something about his dignified sadness makes her pause longer than usual. The dog doesn't rush to the kennel door like the younger ones. He doesn't bark or wag his tail. He simply watches, his gaze heavy with an emotion that seems too human, resignation. The shelter is quiet this evening, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through high windows, casting long shadows across the row of kennels. The worker, Sarah, kneels down, her clipboard pressed against her chest as she studies the old dog. "Hey there, buddy," she calls softly, her voice gentle in the sterile environment. The retriever's ears twitch slightly, a small acknowledgement, but he makes no move to approach. His body remains curled tightly in the corner, as if trying to make himself as small as possible in this strange, frightening place. Sarah checks the paperwork on her clipboard. The intake form is sparse: male golden retriever, estimated 12 to 13 years old, surrendered that morning with no name provided, no medical history, just a hastily scrawled signature and a vague reason: can't keep anymore. Something about this doesn't sit right with her. Most people who surrender beloved pets at least provide their names, some history, something to help the next owners. This form feels deliberately empty, as if someone was rushing to sever all connections. "I'll be back," she promises the old dog, who blinks slowly in response. In the shelter's administrative office, Sarah logs into the computer system. Standard protocol for all new intakes includes scanning for a microchip, and she pulls up the results from this morning's scan. What she finds makes her breath catch in her throat. This dog isn't nameless after all. His name is Max, and he's been registered to the same family, the Wilsons, for 12 years. 12 years of companionship, of Christmas mornings and summer vacations, of children growing up with his gentle presence, all ended with "can't keep anymore" on a form. Sarah's fingers fly across the keyboard, pulling up the contact information associated with the microchip. The address listed is in an upscale neighborhood across town, not the kind of place where people typically can't afford to care for their pets. She picks up the phone and dials the number, expecting perhaps an explanation, maybe even a mistake. The number has been disconnected. A quick social media search reveals something that makes her stomach twist: recent posts from the Wilson family about their exciting move to a luxury condo complex, known for its strict no-pets policy. Photos of the parents and their now college-aged children celebrating their new home, with no mention of the dog that had been part of their family photos for over a decade. The latest post, just 3 days ago, reads, "New chapter begins. Empty nesters enjoying the simple life." Sarah's hands clench around her mouse. Simple for them, perhaps. Not so simple for Max, abandoned in his golden years when he needed them most. The shelter's veterinarian had noted moderate arthritis, some dental disease, and the beginnings of cataracts, nothing unusual for a dog his age, and nothing that justified abandonment. As she walks back to the kennel area, Sarah's mind is filled with images from the Wilson family's social media: birthday parties where a younger, vibrant Max wore silly hats, beach trips where he splashed in the waves, backyard barbecues where he lay patiently beside the grill. 12 years of memories, discarded for a condo with a view. Max hasn't moved from his corner when she returns. She unlocks his kennel door and steps inside, sitting down cross-legged on the concrete floor, giving him space. "So your name is Max," she says softly. At the sound of his name, his head lifts slightly, eyes meeting hers with a spark of recognition that quickly fades back to resignation. "I know, boy. I know this isn't what you expected after all these years." From her pocket, Sarah removes a small treat, placing it on the floor between them. Max looks at it, then back at her, making no move to take it. His brown eyes seem to ask a question she can't answer. Why am I here? Where are my people? What did I do wrong? The heartbreaking reality hits her fully then. Max doesn't understand what's happened. He can't comprehend that the family he loved and protected for 12 years chose a view over his devotion. In his mind, they must be coming back. They must have left him here temporarily. Any moment now, they'll walk through those doors, call his name, take him home. That's why he perks up at every sound of the sheltered door opening. That's why his eyes dart hopefully toward the entrance whenever footsteps approach. Max is waiting for a reunion that will never come. Sarah slides a little closer, still giving him his space. "I'm so sorry," she whispers, her voice catching. "You deserved better than this." Slowly, cautiously, Max uncurls himself from his tight ball. His movements are stiff, joints clearly painful as he takes one uncertain step toward her, then another. When he's close enough, he stretches his neck out, sniffing her outstretched hand. The intake notes mentioned he'd been well-behaved during his surrender, showing no aggression despite obvious distress. Typical golden retriever temperament, gentle and trusting even when being betrayed by those he trusted most. Sarah remains still, letting Max make the choices. After a long moment, he takes the treat from the floor, chewing it slowly without enthusiasm. It's not joy or pleasure that drives him to eat. This dog's story won't end here in his shelter kennel. Somehow, she'll find a way to give him the love and dignity he deserves in his golden years. His family may have failed him, but she won't. As if sensing her thoughts, Max sighs deeply in his sleep, his body relaxing slightly for perhaps the first time since his arrival. The sight of this noble old dog finding a moment's peace steals Sarah's resolve. Max's story is one of heartbreaking betrayal, but it doesn't have to end that way. Second chances come in many forms, and sometimes the deepest loyalties are formed not with those who've known us the longest, but with those who see our worth when others have looked away. Before we get into the story of Max's journey and the remarkable events that followed his abandonment, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. If you believe in second chances and the unbreakable spirit of senior dogs, don't forget to subscribe. Max's story is just beginning, and what happens next will restore your faith in the bonds that can form even after the deepest betrayals. Sarah walked through the quiet shelter hallway the next morning, clipboard in hand as the early sunlight cast warm patches through the barred windows. The weekend drop-offs always left her feeling drained, but today her mind was fixed on one dog in particular. The soft whimpering sound caught her attention as she passed Max's kennel. She turned to see the elderly golden retriever still curled in the same corner, his food and water barely touched since yesterday. His muzzle, white with age, rested on his paws, but his roomy eyes followed her movement with quiet awareness. "Good morning, Max," Sarah called softly, using his name deliberately. The dog's ears perked slightly at the sound, a flicker of recognition crossing his tired face. Sarah unlocked the kennel door and stepped inside, keeping her movements slow and predictable. Max watched her approach, his body tense but not fearful. There was an intelligence in his gaze that spoke of years spent learning human behaviors and emotions. 12 years with a family who had taught him to trust, only to betray that trust in the end. Sarah settled cross-legged on the floor near him, not too close. She placed her clipboard aside and simply sat in silence, letting Max adjust to her presence. The morning bustle of the shelter continued around them, feeding times, cleaning routines, the occasional bark or whimper from other kennels, but inside this small space, Sarah created a bubble of calm for the bewildered senior dog. "You must be hungry," she said after a while, pulling a small container from her pocket. "Sheep broth. Some boiled chicken from home, something more tempting than the standard kibble." The subtle shift in Max's posture told her he could smell it, a slight lift of his head, a barely perceptible sniff. His tail gave a single weak thump against the concrete floor, more reflex than enthusiasm. With gentle fingers, Sarah placed a small piece of chicken on the floor between them. Max stared at it, then at her, his internal struggle visible in his eyes. Hunger versus caution, hope versus resignation. After what seemed like an eternity, he slowly stretched his neck forward, taking the chicken with delicate teeth. His movements were stiff, each shift of weight clearly causing discomfort in his arthritic joints. As Max chewed, Sarah spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about the shelter, about the good people who volunteered there, about the families who came looking for dogs to love. She wasn't sure if her words mattered, but the rhythm of human speech seemed to comfort him. His eyes remained fixed on her, as if trying to understand this new person who showed him kindness without expectation. When he finished the chicken, Sarah cautiously offered another piece in her open palm. This time, Max rose slowly to his feet, his legs trembling slightly with the effort. He took 3 careful steps toward her, a monumental journey of trust, and gently took the food from her hand. His warm breath against her palm made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. As he backed away to eat his second piece, Sarah noticed his collar more clearly, worn leather, cracked with age, the tag so old the engraving had almost worn away. She leaned forward slowly, giving Max plenty of time to move away if he chose. When he allowed her to touch the collar, she carefully turned the tag to read it. Max, it said simply, and a phone number that likely matched the disconnected one she'd tried yesterday. Something caught her eye, a small bulge in the collar's lining. With careful fingers, she found a tiny tear in the leather and extracted what appeared to be a folded piece of paper, protected by a small plastic bag. Max watched her curiously, his head tilted slightly to one side. Sarah carefully opened the makeshift waterproof package. Inside was a child's drawing, faded with time, a crayon picture of a golden dog surrounded by stick figures, with childish handwriting. "Max is the best dog ever. Love, Emily." The date in the corner was 8 years ago. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was holding, a treasured keepsake, something slipped into his collar years ago by a child who loved him, carried by Max all this time without knowing. This wasn't just an old dog. This was someone's childhood companion, a being who had witnessed birthday parties and school graduations, family arguments and reconciliations, all the intimate moments of domestic life, now discarded when he became inconvenient. With trembling fingers, Sarah gently returned the drawing to its protective cover and tucked it back into the collar. Max seemed to understand she'd found something important. He sat watching her with those wise, sad eyes that had seen too much of human fickleness. Sarah reached for her phone and opened the shelter's system. She pulled up Max's intake form again, scanning for any information she might have missed. The surrender form had been signed by Richard Wilson, with only a hurried scrawl where details about the dog's history should have been. The veterinary notes from yesterday's intake examination painted a clearer picture. Male golden retriever, approximately 12 to 13 years old. Moderate arthritis in hips and shoulders. Dental disease with some tooth loss. Early cataracts beginning to form. Otherwise healthy for his age. Sweet temperament despite obvious stress. As she scrolled through the standard documentation, Sarah caught the final note from the intake coordinator. Owner declined to stay for behavior assessment. Stated they were in a hurry. Dog showed signs of distress as owner left without looking back. Without looking back. The phrase burned in Sarah's mind as she gazed at Max, who had settled back onto the concrete floor, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but still watching her face. 12 years of loyalty, and they couldn't even give him a proper goodbye, a final pat on the head, a last moment of reassurance. Sarah's administrative fatigue vanished instantly as she pulled up the Wilson's full surrender form. Her heart began to pound as she read through the official reason for surrender. Moving to apartment that doesn't allow pets. Cannot take him with us. A quick property records search showed the lie for what it was. They'd purchased a luxury beachfront condo, not rented an apartment. They'd made a choice, not faced an insurmountable obstacle. Without hesitation, Sarah began scrolling through the shelter's protocols for abandoned animals. Max watched her intently, as if sensing her determination. He struggled to his feet again, moving closer until his shoulder pressed against her leg. The weight of him, warm and solid, felt like both a responsibility and a privilege. We're going to figure this out, Sarah promised, her hand gently stroking his graying muzzle. Max looked up at her, and for the first time, his tail wagged with genuine hope, not the desperate hope of reunion with his family, but perhaps the beginning of trust in something new. The shelter's medical examination room felt especially stark that afternoon. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Max's thin frame as Sarah and the veterinarian, Dr. Chen, examined him more thoroughly. His coat, once likely lustrous, hung dull and patchy in places. The examining table's cold metal seemed to emphasize how clinical his life had become, from family pet to shelter statistic in a single afternoon. Let's get a more comprehensive look at what we're dealing with, Dr. Chen said, her gentle hands moving methodically over Max's body. Sarah stood at his head, stroking his ears and murmuring reassurances as the vet checked his joints, teeth, eyes, and internal organs. Moderate arthritis, as noted yesterday, particularly in the hips and shoulders, Dr. Chen confirmed. He's probably been dealing with this for a while. There are calluses on his elbows consistent with a dog who has difficulty getting up from hard surfaces. She shook her head slightly. A softer bed and some proper medication would make a world of difference. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the Wilsons. Had they denied him even these basic comforts in his senior years? Dr. Chen continued her examination, checking Max's teeth with careful fingers. Significant dental disease here. He'd benefit from a cleaning and probably some extractions, but would need to be careful with anesthesia at his age. She listened to his heart and lungs, nodding with satisfaction. Strong heartbeat, clear lungs. His overall condition suggests he's been fed regularly, at least. As the examination continued, Sarah noticed how still Max remained, accepting each potentially uncomfortable touch with stoic patience. This wasn't his first veterinary examination. He knew the routine and understood cooperation would make it end sooner. Such a good boy, even now, when the people who taught him to be good had abandoned him. His blood work from yesterday shows some early kidney values to watch, but nothing critical yet, Dr. Chen said, reviewing the chart. With appropriate senior care, proper diet, joint supplements, pain management for the arthritis, he could have several comfortable years ahead of him. She looked up at Sarah, her expression softening. He's clearly been loved for most of his life. The medical neglect seems recent. Sarah nodded, thinking of the Wilsons' social media posts from the past year, the lavish vacations, the new cars, the renovations to their home before selling it. Had Max's care been sacrificed as they prepared for their empty nester lifestyle? Had they decided he wasn't worth the investment anymore? I'd like to start him on an anti-inflammatory for the arthritis, Dr. Chen continued, writing notes in Max's file, and a supplement for his joints. The shelter budget is tight, but I'll cover it, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her own certainty. Whatever he needs, Dr.
Chen smiled knowingly. You're fostering him, aren't you?
Sarah looked down at Max, who gazed back with quiet dignity despite the indignity of being examined on a cold metal table.
I haven't exactly cleared it with management yet, but, yes, he can't stay in the kennels, not after everything he's been through.
As if understanding her words, Max leaned his weight against her, his warm body pressing into her side in a silent gesture of gratitude. The smell of antiseptic and cleaning products hung in the air around them, so different from the comforting sense of a family home he'd known for 12 years. Yet somehow, in this sterile environment, something precious was forming, a bond built on compassion rather than obligation.
I think that's an excellent idea, Dr. Chen said, scratching Max gently behind the ears. Senior dogs often shut down in shelter environments. They don't show well to potential adopters when they're depressed. She lowered her voice, though they were alone in the room. Between us, dogs like Max rarely get adopted. People want puppies or young adults, not seniors with medical needs. The truth hurt, but Sarah had known it already. That's why she'd made her decision before even consciously acknowledging it. She wouldn't let Max spend his remaining years in a kennel, waiting for a family that would likely never come. Home. The word hung in the air between them. Sarah's small one-bedroom apartment wasn't much, but it would be infinitely better than the kennel. As Dr.
Chen left to see her next patient, Sarah helped Max down from the examination table, supporting his weight as his paws found the floor. His legs trembled slightly from standing so long on the hard surface. Just you and me now, buddy, she said softly, kneeling to look him in the eyes. Max held her gaze, his brown eyes reflecting years of wisdom and recent pain. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost deliberate, he raised his paw and placed it gently on her arm.
The simple act of trust brought tears to Sarah's eyes.
That evening, after convincing her supervisor to let her foster Max, Sarah helped him into her car. He needed a boost to manage the height, his arthritic hips making the jump impossible. Once settled in the back seat, he sat upright, looking out the window with alert interest, the first real enthusiasm he'd shown since his arrival at the shelter. Sarah's apartment manager raised his eyebrows when she explained the situation. A temporary foster, just until we find him a permanent solution, she promised, though they both knew the odds of finding a forever home for a senior dog with medical needs were slim. The no pets clause in her lease suddenly seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, but to her surprise, the manager's stern expression softened as he looked at Max. My parents had Goldens all through my childhood, he said, reaching down to let Max sniff his hand.
Best dogs in the world. Just keep him quiet, and make sure he doesn't damage anything. Relief washed over Sarah as she thanked him profusely.
Inside her small apartment, Max stood in the entryway, uncertain, his nails clicking on the hardwood as he tentatively explored. He found a patch of afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room window and settled there, his body heavy with exhaustion from the day's events. Sarah busied herself setting up the supplies she'd brought from the shelter, a plush dog bed, food and water bowls, joint supplements disguised as treats. Max watched her movements with tired interest, his eyes following her from room to room when she was in his sight, his ears perking up anxiously when she disappeared from view. That night, Sarah placed the dog bed next to her own, hoping Max would feel more secure knowing she was nearby. But when she emerged from the bathroom after her evening routine, she found Max had dragged himself to her bedroom door, sleeping on the hard floor rather than on his new bed, but needing to be close to his new human. The sight broke her heart all over again.
How long had he been sleeping on hard surfaces, his arthritic joints receiving no relief?
How long had the Wilsons ignored his needs while planning their new life without him? With gentle hands, Sarah coaxed Max onto his new bed, now positioned right beside her own. He settled with a deep sigh, his eyes watching her until they slowly closed in exhaustion. In the quiet darkness, Sarah lay awake, listening to his slow, steady breathing, wondering what memories played behind his closed eyes.
Did he dream of running on beaches with children who were now in college? Did he remember the family who had discarded him? Or was his mind, like his loyal heart, already beginning to make room for new possibilities?
The pale moonlight filtered through Sarah's curtains as she watched Max sleep fitfully beside her bed. His legs twitched occasionally in dreams, chasing squirrels, perhaps, or running through familiar yards from his past. Relief washed over Sarah as she thanked him profusely. Inside her small apartment, Max stood in the entryway, uncertain, his nails clicking on the hardwood as he tentatively explored. He found a patch of afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room window and settled there, his body heavy with exhaustion from the day's events. Sarah busied herself setting up the supplies she'd brought from the shelter, a plush dog bed, food and water bowls, joint supplements disguised as treats. Max watched her movements with tired interest, his eyes following her from room to room when she was in his sight, his ears perking up anxiously when she disappeared from view. That night, Sarah placed the dog bed next to her own, hoping Max would feel more secure knowing she was nearby. But when she emerged from the bathroom after her evening routine, she found Max had dragged himself to her bedroom door, sleeping on the hard floor rather than on his new bed, but needing to be close to his new human. The sight broke her heart all over again.
How long had he been sleeping on hard surfaces, his arthritic joints receiving no relief?
How long had the Wilsons ignored his needs while planning their new life without him? With gentle hands, Sarah coaxed Max onto his new bed, now positioned right beside her own. He settled with a deep sigh, his eyes watching her until they slowly closed in exhaustion. In the quiet darkness, Sarah lay awake, listening to his slow, steady breathing, wondering what memories played behind his closed eyes.
Did he dream of running on beaches with children who were now in college? Did he remember the family who had discarded him? Or was his mind, like his loyal heart, already beginning to make room for new possibilities?
The pale moonlight filtered through Sarah's curtains as she watched Max sleep fitfully beside her bed. His legs twitched occasionally in dreams, chasing squirrels, perhaps, or running through familiar yards from his past. She had placed his water bowl nearby, but his food remained untouched. Even the special senior formula she'd mixed with warm chicken broth hadn't tempted him. With gentle movements, careful not to startle him, she placed a hand on his side, feeling his ribs more prominently than she should. In his sleep, Max leaned slightly into her touch, seeking warmth and connection even in unconsciousness. The gesture of trust, so simple yet profound from a dog who had every reason to mistrust humans, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Tomorrow, she would take the first steps toward giving Max the dignity and care he deserved. She would consult with Dr.
Chen about pain management options for his arthritis. She would research senior dog nutrition to tempt his appetite.
She would post his story on the shelter's social media, not with the expectation of adoption, but to raise awareness about senior dog abandonment. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, with Max's warm body finally relaxing into deeper sleep beside her, Sarah made a different kind of promise, not to the world, but to this one dog who had been discarded after a lifetime of loyalty.
"I see you, Max," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking the soft fur between his eyes. "I won't look away."
In his sleep, Max sighed deeply, his body seeming to release some of the tension it had carried since his abandonment. Perhaps, in some corner of his canine consciousness, he understood that while one chapter had ended cruelly, another was just beginning, one where he would be valued not despite his age and ailments, but with full acknowledgement of the dignity he'd earned through years of faithful companionship. Morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows as Sarah prepared for work. The aroma of coffee filled the small kitchen, mixing with the scent of the scrambled eggs she'd made, half for herself, half cooled and mixed with the special senior dog food. She had placed his water bowl nearby, but his food remained untouched. Even the special senior formula she'd mixed with warm chicken broth hadn't tempted him. With gentle movements, careful not to startle him, she placed a hand on his side, feeling his ribs more prominently than she should. In his sleep, Max leaned slightly into her touch, seeking warmth and connection even in unconsciousness. The gesture of trust, so simple yet profound from a dog who had every reason to mistrust humans, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Tomorrow, she would take the first steps toward giving Max the dignity and care he deserved. She would consult with Dr.
Chen about pain management options for his arthritis. She would research senior dog nutrition to tempt his appetite.
She would post his story on the shelter's social media, not with the expectation of adoption, but to raise awareness about senior dog abandonment. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, with Max's warm body finally relaxing into deeper sleep beside her, Sarah made a different kind of promise, not to the world, but to this one dog who had been discarded after a lifetime of loyalty.
"I see you, Max," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking the soft fur between his eyes. "I won't look away."
In his sleep, Max sighed deeply, his body seeming to release some of the tension it had carried since his abandonment. Perhaps, in some corner of his canine consciousness, he understood that while one chapter had ended cruelly, another was just beginning, one where he would be valued not despite his age and ailments, but with full acknowledgement of the dignity he'd earned through years of faithful companionship. Morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows as Sarah prepared for work. The aroma of coffee filled the small kitchen, mixing with the scent of the scrambled eggs she'd made, half for herself, half cooled and mixed with the special senior dog food
Chen had recommended.
Max watched her every move from his new spot by the kitchen doorway, his head resting on his paws, eyes tracking Sarah's movements with quiet attentiveness. Each time she disappeared from view, his ears would perk up anxiously until she reappeared. 3 days had passed since she'd brought him home.
3 days of small victories and heartbreaking setbacks.
Max was eating now, though not with enthusiasm, more like a soldier following orders, consuming what was necessary for survival. He had started taking his medications, skillfully hidden in small pieces of cheese or peanut butter, treatments that Sarah hoped would soon ease the stiffness in his joints and the pain she could see in his careful movements. "I'll be back at lunch to check on you," Sarah promised, gathering her keys and bag. Max's eyes held the knowledge of broken promises as he watched her prepare to leave. His body tensed slightly, the fear of abandonment still fresh in his memory. Sarah knelt beside him, stroking his head gently. "I promise," she added, looking directly into his wise brown eyes. Max blinked slowly, a gesture of trust that cats were known for but that seemed equally meaningful coming from this dignified old dog. At the shelter, Sarah logged into her computer and began her morning routine, checking on overnight intakes, reviewing adoption applications, coordinating with volunteers. But her mind kept drifting back to Max, alone in her apartment, waiting for her return just as he had waited for the Wilsons in those first confusing days at the shelter. During her break, Sarah opened the shelter's social media accounts and began crafting a post. She uploaded the best photo she'd managed to take of Max, sitting in a patch of sunlight in her living room, his face still bearing the traces of sadness but with a new alertness in his eyes. The words came easily, flowing from a place of genuine emotion rather than the usual adoption marketing language. "This is Max. He spent 12 years loving his family unconditionally. He watched their children grow up, moved with them through 4 homes, celebrated birthdays and holidays, and provided comfort during hard times. 2 weeks ago, his family decided they didn't want him anymore. They surrendered him to our shelter with no explanation beyond moving to a place that doesn't allow pets. Max doesn't understand why the people he loved for his entire life abandoned him in his senior years when he needs them most. Senior dogs like Max are often overlooked in shelters. People want puppies, not dogs with arthritis and gray muzzles. But these dignified elders have so much to give, their calm wisdom, their deep gratitude, their gentle companionship." Max is currently in foster care, receiving treatment for arthritis and dental issues that were neglected in his final months with his previous family. He's not officially available for adoption yet, but this post isn't really about finding Max a new home. It's about asking all of you a question. What do we owe the animals who give us their entire lives? If you have an aging pet at home, please give them an extra treat today, a softer bed for their aching joints, or just some quiet time beside you on the couch. They've earned it. Sarah hesitated before hitting post, wondering if the emotion in her words was too personal, too judgmental of Max's former family. But then she remembered the look in his eyes when she'd found the child's drawing in his collar, the quiet dignity in the face of betrayal, and she pressed publish without further hesitation. By the time she returned to her apartment at lunch, the post had been shared over 100 times, accumulating comments from people outraged on Max's behalf and sharing stories of their own senior pets. Sarah felt a small surge of satisfaction as she unlocked her door, greeted by the soft thumping of Max's tail against the floor. He hadn't moved to get up, the arthritis made sudden movements painful, but his eyes lit up at her return, his body relaxing visibly as she entered. "Told you I'd be back," she said softly, kneeling to stroke his ears. Max leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly in contentment. Sarah noticed with pleasure that he'd eaten most of his breakfast and drunk some water. A small victory. That evening, after work, Sarah decided Max had spent enough time confined to the apartment. The anti-inflammatory medication seemed to be helping his mobility, and Dr. Chen had emphasized the importance of gentle, regular exercise to keep his joints from stiffening further. Sarah clipped a new leash to Max's old collar, carefully avoiding disturbing the hidden drawing, and they set out for a slow walk to the small park 2 blocks away. Max moved with the deliberate care of the elderly, each step measured and thoughtful, but Sarah could see the pleasure in his eyes as new scents reached his nose. The fresh air and gentle activity seemed to invigorate him, his head lifting higher with each passing minute. At the park, Sarah found a quiet bench in the corner of the fenced dog area and unclipped his leash, giving him freedom to explore at his own pace. At first, Max stayed close, unsure of this new liberty. He sniffed the ground around the bench, glancing up at Sarah occasionally as if to confirm she was still there. Gradually, his circles widened, his nose guiding him through the fascinating tapestry of scents that make up a dog park's olfactory landscape. Sarah watched him with a smile, noticing how his movements, though slow, had purpose and dignity. A young couple entered the park with an energetic chocolate Labrador puppy who immediately bounded toward Max with the exuberance of youth. Sarah tensed, ready to intervene if the puppy's enthusiasm proved too much for the senior dog. But Max surprised her. As the puppy danced around him, play bowing and yipping for attention, Max's demeanor changed subtly. He straightened his posture, his tail lifting into a gentle wag. With the patience of age, he allowed the puppy to circle him, occasionally lowering his head to offer a gentle greeting. "Sorry about that," the young woman called, hurrying over. "Coco gets so excited around other dogs." "It's okay," Sarah assured her. "Max seems to be enjoying it." The woman looked at Max more carefully, her expression softening. "He's beautiful. How old?" 13, Sarah replied, feeling a strange pride in Max's dignified bearing.
He's new to me. I'm fostering him from the shelter where I work. The woman's partner joined them, watching as Coco continued her dance around the patient older dog.
He's got such a gentle face, he observed. Look how patient he is with our little terror.
Sarah smiled, watching as Max allowed the puppy to sniff his face, responding with a gentle nudge when the investigation became too intrusive. There was something almost grandfatherly in his tolerance, a wisdom that came from years of understanding canine social cues.
For the first time since she'd met him, Max seemed fully in his element, not defined by abandonment or age, but by his essential dogness.
What's his story? The man asked, his voice lowering as if Max might understand.
Sarah hesitated, not wanting to darken the pleasant moment with the reality of Max's situation.
But the truth mattered. It was part of who Max was now.
His family surrendered him after 12 years, she said simply. They moved and decided not to take him. The couple exchanged horrified glances. 12 years, the woman repeated, her voice rising with indignation. How could anyone? She cut herself off, kneeling to extend her hand to Max, who had approached curiously, perhaps sensing he was the subject of conversation. You're better off without them, sweet boy, she murmured, scratching gently under his chin. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sarah clipped Max's leash back on for the walk home.
The couple and their puppy waved goodbye, the woman calling after them, "We'll look for you both here again."
The walk home was slower, Max's energy depleted by the socialization and exercise, but Sarah could see a new contentment in his expression. He had remembered something important today, that he was still capable of joy, still valuable in his own right, still able to connect with others despite his painful past. At home, Max settled onto his plush bed with a deep sigh of contentment, his eyes heavy with healthy tiredness rather than depression. Sarah sat on the floor beside him, gently massaging his shoulders and hips with the techniques Dr.
Chen had demonstrated.
Under her careful touch, she could feel some of the knots in his muscles relaxing, his breathing deepening with pleasure. You did good today, she told him, her voice warm with genuine pride. Max's tail thumped twice against the bed, his eyes meeting hers with what she could swear was gratitude. That night, checking her phone before bed, Sarah was stunned to see that her post about Max had gone viral, shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from around the country. People were outraged by his story, sharing their own experiences with senior pets, offering donations for his care, even inquiring about adoption despite her clear statement that he wasn't available yet. The shelter's donation page had received more contributions in one day than in the previous month. Sarah showed her phone to Max, who was curled on his bed watching her with half-closed eyes. Look at this, buddy. People care about your story. Max blinked sleepily, unimpressed by his internet fame but clearly content with his immediate surroundings, a comfortable bed, a full belly, and a human who had proven trustworthy. In the hierarchy of a dog's needs, these simple comforts outweighed all the virtual outrage and support in the world.
As the days passed, Max's physical condition began to improve noticeably.
The anti-inflammatory medication reduced the stiffness in his joints, allowing him more mobility with less pain. His appetite increased, and the premium senior food began to fill out his once prominent ribs. With gentle daily brushing, his coat regained some of its former luster, though the gray around his muzzle and eyes remained a distinguished badge of his years. But the most remarkable transformation was in his spirit. The dog who had curled into a tight ball of resignation in the shelter kennel now greeted Sarah at the door each evening, a stuffed toy in his mouth, a gift to welcome her home. He still moved with the careful deliberation of age, but there was purpose in his steps, dignity in his bearing. During their daily walks to the park, he held his head higher, his tail gently wagging as he took in the sights and scents of the neighborhood. On Sunday morning, a week and a half after Max had come home with her, Sarah took him for a longer outing. The autumn air was crisp, fallen leaves crunching beneath their measured steps as they walked to a larger park with a pond where ducks gathered. Max showed interest in the birds, watching them with the instinctual focus of a retriever, though he made no move to chase them. They found a quiet bench overlooking the water, and Sarah sat down, patting the space beside her. To her surprise and delight, Max carefully hoisted himself up, settling next to her on the bench, his warm body pressed against her side as they watched the ducks glide across the pond's surface. It was a moment of perfect contentment, the kind of quiet companionship that made words unnecessary.
Almost without thinking, Sarah pulled out a tennis ball from her pocket.
She hadn't planned this, had grabbed it on impulse before leaving the apartment, uncertain if Max would have any interest in play at his age and with his physical limitations. She held it up, showing it to him without expectation. Max's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a quickening of attention, a slight lift of his ears, a focused intensity in his gaze.
Sarah smiled, giving the ball a gentle toss. It rolled rather than bounced, traveling just a few feet across the grass. Max watched its path, something awakening in his eyes.
After a long moment of internal deliberation, he eased himself down from the bench and hobbled toward the ball.
Sarah held her breath, not wanting to pressure him but hoping for this small return to joy. With deliberate movements, Max reached the ball, sniffed it carefully, and then, with the dignified purpose of an elder remembering a beloved skill, he gently picked it up in his mouth. The walk back to Sarah was slow, each step measured against the arthritis pain, but his eyes held a spark that transcended physical discomfort. When he dropped the ball at her feet and looked up expectantly, Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. This wasn't the exuberant play of a puppy but something perhaps more precious, the considered choice of an old dog reclaiming a piece of happiness he thought was lost forever. Sarah threw the ball a few more times, each toss gentle and short, mindful of Max's limitations. He retrieved each one with the same careful determination, the joy in his eyes growing with each successful return. They played until Sarah noticed him slowing further, his breathing becoming more labored. Knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to begin. "Good boy, Max," she said, kneeling to stroke his head when he returned the ball one final time. "Such a good boy." Max leaned against her legs, his body trembling slightly with exertion but his eyes bright with satisfaction. In that moment, Sarah made a decision she'd been contemplating for days. Max wouldn't be put up for adoption. He had found his forever home already, with her. The temporary foster arrangement would become permanent. She would give him all the comfort, dignity, and love he deserved for however many years he had left. As they walked slowly home, Sarah's phone buzzed with an email notification. Expecting another shelter matter, she was surprised to see the sender's name, Emily Wilson. The subject line read simply, "About Max." Sarah stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding. Emily, the same name signed on the drawing hidden in Max's collar. It had to be the daughter, now college-aged according to the social media posts Sarah had seen. Max looked up at her, sensing her sudden tension. With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the email. "Dear MS. Parker, I saw your post about Max. I've been away at college and just found out what my parents did. I never would have let this happen if I'd known. Max has been my dog since I was 6 years old. I was told he was staying with my grandparents temporarily while my parents settled into the new condo. I'm coming home for fall break next weekend and want to see him. Please, he might be the only one who remembers me, but I remember everything about him." Emily Wilson. Sarah read the message twice, conflicting emotions washing over her. Anger at the parents who had lied not only to the shelter but to their own daughter. Relief that at least one member of Max's former family had cared enough to reach out. Anxiety about what this might mean for Max's future, and her own plans to adopt him permanently. She looked down at Max, who gazed back with complete trust, unaware that his past and future were colliding in the glowing screen of Sarah's phone. What would seeing Emily do to him? Would it reopen wounds just beginning to heal? Or would it provide some closure, some understanding that not everyone he loved had abandoned him? The shelter manager called Sarah into her office the following week. "The Wilsons saw our post about Max," she said, her expression troubled. "They're claiming they made a mistake and want him back." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she processed this information. A mistake? They abandoned a senior dog after 12 years. The manager sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, I agree with you completely. But legally, there are complications. They're claiming emotional distress, saying they were under pressure during the move and made a hasty decision they now regret." Sarah fought to keep her voice steady. "They lied on the surrender form. They claimed they were moving to an apartment that didn't allow pets. They bought a luxury condo. That was a choice, not a necessity." "I know," the manager repeated, her eyes sympathetic. "And that may help our case. But they've hired an attorney, and they're threatening to make this difficult for us." She paused, watching Sarah carefully. "There's something else. Their daughter has reached out separately, hasn't she?" Sarah nodded, surprised. "Emily emailed me directly. She said she didn't know about the surrender. She's coming home from college this weekend and wants to see Max." The manager tapped her pen thoughtfully against her desk. "That complicates things further. Family disputes aren't something we want to get in the middle of." She sighed deeply. "Look, I know how attached you become to Max. I can see it in how you talk about him, in the care you've given him. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that this could get messy." Sarah spent the evening researching animal abandonment laws and precedents, her laptop balanced on her knees as Max dozed beside her on the couch, his head heavy on her lap. His peaceful sleep contrasted sharply with the turmoil in her mind as she read through case after case where pets were treated as property rather than beings with emotional needs and attachments. "I won't let them take you just to abandon you again," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his ears. Max's eyes opened briefly at the sound of her voice, trust shining in their brown depths before he drifted back to sleep. Sarah hadn't responded to Emily's email yet, uncertain what to say or how much to reveal about her conflict with the Wilsons. But as Max slept trustingly beside her, Sarah made her decision. She would allow Emily to visit Max.
Whatever happened with the legal situation, the young woman deserved to see the dog she'd grown up with, the companion who had carried her childhood drawing in his collar for 8 years. The meeting was arranged for Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, the same park where Max had rediscovered the joy of retrieving a tennis ball. Sarah arrived early, Max walking calmly beside her, unaware of the significance of this outing. They found a quiet bench in the sunshine, and Sarah sat, her stomach tight with anxiety as she watched the park entrance. Emily arrived exactly on time, a tall young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a university sweatshirt. Sarah recognized her immediately from the Wilson family photos she'd seen online, though the girl had been younger then. Emily scanned the park, spotting them on the bench, and for a moment she froze, her hand rising to cover her mouth. "Max," she called, her voice breaking slightly. At the sound of his name and a once familiar voice, Max's head swiveled toward Emily. He stared intently, his body growing still with concentration as he processed what his aging eyes were seeing. For a terrible moment, Sarah feared he wouldn't recognize her. That time and trauma had erased the connection. Then Max struggled to his feet, a whine escaping his throat, the first vocalization Sarah had heard from him since she'd met him. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as Emily approached, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, Max," she sobbed, dropping to her knees in front of him. "I'm so sorry, boy. I'm so sorry." Max pressed forward into her embrace, his entire body wiggling with joy despite the limitations of his arthritis. He licked the tears from her face, his tail wagging so hard his whole back end swayed. This was not the reserved, dignified greeting of a dog meeting a friendly stranger. This was the ecstatic reunion of a dog with someone he truly loved. Sarah watched, her own eyes filling with tears at the bittersweet scene. The joy of their reunion was undeniable, but so was the reality of what had happened, and what might still happen if the Wilsons succeeded in their bid to reclaim Max. Emily finally looked up at Sarah, her arms still around Max's neck. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking care of him when my family failed him." The simple acknowledgement, so different from the entitled demands of the Wilsons' attorney, touched Sarah deeply. "He's an amazing dog," she replied softly. "He deserved better than what happened to him." Emily nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand while Max continued to press against her, unwilling to lose physical contact now that he'd found her again. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking again. "I swear I didn't know. They told me he was staying with my grandparents because the condo association needed time to process his pet registration. I found out the truth when my roommate saw your post and recognized him from my photos." "I believe you," Sarah said, and she did. The genuine grief and love in Emily's interaction with Max couldn't be faked. They sat together on the bench, Max wedged between them, periodically turning his head from one to the other as if to ensure they were both still there. Emily stroked his fur with familiar hands, finding all his favorite spots without hesitation, behind his right ear, under his chin, the spot between his shoulder blades that was hard for him to reach. These were the touches of someone who truly knew him, who had grown up learning. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "What if we found a compromise? What if Max stayed with you until I finish this semester? I'll be home for winter break in 6 weeks, and by then I'll have figured out a pet-friendly housing situation near campus. You've done so much for him already, getting his medical issues addressed, giving him a loving temporary home. Would you be willing to keep fostering him a little longer?" The proposal caught Sarah off guard. It was reasonable, considerate of Max's well-being, and acknowledged the care she'd provided, everything the Wilsons' legal demands were not. It also meant giving up Max eventually, a prospect that sent a sharp pain through her heart. "What about your parents' legal claim?" Sarah asked. Emily's expression hardened again. "Leave that to me. They might not care what I think, but they do care what I might say to their friends and business associates. I have leverage." Sarah looked down at Max, sleeping peacefully with his head now resting on Emily's knee. The reality was that she'd always known their time together would be temporary. She'd expected to lose him to the Rainbow Bridge in a few years, not to a previous owner, but the principle remained the same. What mattered most was Max's well-being, not her own attachment. "Let me think about it," she said finally, "and I'll need to discuss it with the shelter's management and legal team. Your parents' attorney has complicated things." Emily nodded, understanding in her eyes. They exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch about Max's situation. As they prepared to leave, Emily knelt before Max one last time, cupping his face in her hands. "I'll see you again soon, old friend," she promised, pressing her forehead briefly against his. "I'm not disappearing from your life ever again." Max whined softly as she walked away, watching her retreating figure with confusion evident in his posture. He looked up at Sarah as if asking why they weren't following his rediscovered person. Sarah knelt beside him, stroking his side gently. "I know, buddy," she said softly. "It's complicated.
but we'll figure it out together. The shelter's conference room felt overly bright as Sarah sat across from the Wilson family, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, dressed in expensive casual wear that somehow still looked formal, and their teenage daughter Emily, who couldn't meet Sarah's eyes. The shelter manager, Jessica, sat beside Sarah, along with Marta Delgado, a local animal welfare attorney who had volunteered her services after seeing Max's story online. Max lay at Sarah's feet, his body tense despite the calming pheromone spray Jessica had suggested using before the meeting. 2 weeks had passed since Emily's visit to the park. 2 weeks of legal back and forth, of angry phone calls from Mr. Wilson to the shelter, of tearful late-night texts from Emily, caught between loyalty to her parents and her love for Max. Sarah had continued fostering him during this time, watching his health improve daily with proper medication and care, falling more deeply in love with his gentle spirit even as she prepared herself for the possibility of losing him. Mrs. Wilson spoke first, her manicured hands folded precisely on the table, her voice practiced in the calm tones of someone accustomed to getting her way. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today," she began, her eyes flicking briefly to Max before returning to Sarah's face. "There's been a misunderstanding that we'd like to clear up. The surrender of our dog was a hasty decision made during a very stressful time. Moving is difficult, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and we made a regrettable error in judgment." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek to keep from interrupting. The careful wording, "our dog, regrettable error," seemed designed to minimize what they had done, to reframe abandonment as a simple mistake. "We've since realized how much Max means to our family," Mrs. Wilson continued, gesturing toward Emily, who still stared at her hands in her lap. "Especially to our daughter. We'd like to correct our mistake and bring him home where he belongs." Mr. Wilson cleared his throat, adding in a voice that suggested the matter was already settled, "We're prepared to make a generous donation to the shelter, of course, in recognition of your temporary care." The emphasis on temporary wasn't subtle. Sarah felt her anger rising but remained silent, waiting for Jessica or Marta to respond. It was Jessica who spoke, her voice professional but cool. "We appreciate your willingness to meet today, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. As I'm sure your attorney has explained, surrender of an animal to a shelter constitutes legal relinquishment of ownership. Max has been in our legal custody for nearly a month now." Mr. Wilson leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Our attorney believes we have a strong case for emotional distress and coerced surrender. We weren't in a proper state of mind to make such a decision." Marta Delgado smiled thinly, sliding a folder across the table. "Perhaps your attorney would be interested in reviewing these documents. The surrender form you sign clearly states that relinquishment is permanent and irrevocable. Additionally, we have documentation that you provided false information on that form, stating you were moving to an apartment complex that didn't allow pets, when property records show you purchased a luxury condominium with no such restrictions." Mrs. Wilson's carefully composed expression faltered. "We were told the condo association had pet restrictions. Your signature appears on the association bylaws as part of your purchase agreement," Marta continued, her voice steady. "The bylaws explicitly state that pets under 50 pounds are permitted with proper registration. Max weighs 42 pounds according to his veterinary records." The room fell silent as the implications settled. Max shifted at Sarah's feet, a small whine escaping him as he sensed the tension. Sarah reached down automatically to reassure him, her fingers finding the soft spot behind his ears that always calmed him. Emily finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Mom, Dad, please stop. This isn't right." Mrs. Wilson turned to her daughter, a warning in her eyes. "Emily, we discussed this. We're trying to bring Max home." "No, you're not," Emily replied, her voice stronger than Sarah had expected. "You're trying to save face because people found out what you did. You told me you were sending Max to live with Grandma and Grandpa, but they didn't even know about it. You abandoned him and lied to me." Mr. Wilson's face darkened. "That's enough. This isn't the place, then where is the place?" Emily demanded, tears welling in her eyes. "You won't talk about it at home. You won't admit what you really did. You just keep saying it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It was a choice." The raw pain in her voice silenced the room. Max, hearing her distress, struggled to his feet and moved toward Emily, his arthritic gait slow but determined. He reached her chair and pressed against her leg, looking up with concerned eyes. Emily slid from her seat to kneel beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered against his fur. "I should have been there. I should have stopped them." Sarah watched the reunion with a lump in her throat. Max's capacity for forgiveness, for love despite betrayal, never ceased to amaze her. She glanced at the Wilsons and saw something shift in Mrs. Wilson's expression, not quite remorse, perhaps, but discomfort at being confronted with the emotional reality of what they had done. Jessica broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. I think we need to refocus this conversation on what's best for Max. He's a senior dog with medical needs that were neglected before his surrender. He's been thriving in Sarah's care, with a consistent medication schedule for his arthritis and proper senior nutrition. Mr. Wilson bristled visibly. Are you suggesting we weren't caring for him properly? We had that dog for 12 years. Max's veterinary records show his last checkup was over 18 months ago, Marta replied calmly. The examining vet noted moderate to severe dental disease and untreated arthritis that had likely been causing him pain for some time. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. He couldn't even climb 3 steps when I first took him home, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. He was sleeping on hard surfaces because it hurt too much to get up once he'd laid down. 2 weeks of proper medication and a good diet have transformed him. Emily looked up from where she still knelt beside Max, her tear-stained face hardening as she took in this new information. You told me he was getting old and slowing down naturally, she said to her parents. You never said he was in pain.